Okay, so now usually we would have had the presentation by Katja. And to maybe fill in the blank for the part of the reflection on ethics that she would have given, I'm just going to quickly summarize some of her points that she probably would have made. So please fill in wherever I'm lacking. Okay, so she was presenting her project, which was called Xenozoopolis. And basically this stems from this idea of xenofeminism. And I think she's also very much a fan of this book, which is made by a community which is called Laboria Cubonics. And they're basically trying to, they have like this theory which they want to keep alive, but through that theory, they're trying to rethink how we can actually think and design and live in future scenarios. So I'm just going to read a piece that Katja wrote about this xenofeminism. So xenofeminism is premised on three fundamental ideas: technomaterialism, anti-naturalism, and gender abolitionism. Despite such big and controversial words, the ideas at its basis are quite simple. Technomaterialism can be here understood as the rejection of dominant feminist tendency of conceiving science and technology as inherently patriarchal. Xenofeminism certainly acknowledges the complex network of power dynamics in which techno-scientific production is embedded and its propensity for imbalance, abuse, and exploitation of the weak. Yet rather than pretending to risk nothing, it advocates for its appropriation and redistribution. Once again, technology bears the promise of feminist liberation, or, more precisely, of re-engineering the world linked to a collective theoretical and political thinking in women, queers, and gender non-conforming play an unparalleled role. So what is interesting is this idea of like how this idea of xenofeminism is like a continuation of feminism, and also these feminisms by Haraway, for instance, that move beyond the duality of women, but actually go towards the more than human reflection of how we can think of otherness in general and how we imagine worlds. And specifically here in the Xenofeminist Manifesto, where they actually say in one of their quotes, "If nature is unjust, change nature." And I think that's also where this techno-materialist voice comes into play, where they actually say, okay, nature is understood as a space of conflict of interests which conditions and limits lived experiences based on actually these feminist experience of otherness. And therefore they must be corrected by techno-scientific innovation, put at the service of the common good and against power imbalance. And as the manifesto concludes, they also just say, like, if nature is unjust, change nature. So to wrap up and say what actually Katja sort of, how she sort of sees that in Xenozoopolis. She writes, by breaking down the human alien binary, it rejects the naturalization of all oppressive and discriminatory structures, including speciesism, both at the level of the animal exploitation and at the level of idealizing laissez-faire towards the lives of wild animals. Xenofeminism engenders the Xenozoopolis, a future scenario in which feminist emancipation contributes to a universalist politics assembled from the needs of every sentient being, cutting across race, ability, economic standing, species, and geographical position. Yeah, so that's sort of the general scope of, I think, where she is heading. And I think what her presentation would have added to this discussion, so I think it's really interesting, Katie, that your points are maybe more making the farmer a bit more like, what is the alternative towards moving more towards the techno-scientific side of production. And I think where maybe nature has proven not to always be like fully being the solution, like how can we actually program it differently in a way that it could actually be beneficial for more than humans. So there's really this, I mean, there's two different approaches, of course, to it. I would also like to invite you up for the panel discussion, because I think this really opens up the question of what is the ethics of how can we actually, like if we go from the treatment of a cow as a data set from the reflections of biopolitics, and then go towards, okay, the ethics of optimization and modification, and how the cow is actually suffering health issues through these productions of how we contemporary see care, and how that maybe this neglection of nature as a solution, or maybe nature as a solution, and the potential there in technology, how that maybe can be solved by thinking from a feminist kind of perspective, going beyond this otherness and really trying to see how can we live in kinship with animals, with cows. And I think this is actually the most central question. That's also where we talked about earlier, like what is the need of the contemporary cow if a cow is so manipulated by humans already before? So it's really like, what kind of choices can we make for cows if they cannot, or maybe like how can we listen to cows better? How can we really investigate and really alter the landscapes towards their needs instead of our needs? And how can we maybe politically and profit-wise make this a structure which is worth and valuable for the market, so that we can actually do this? Yeah, I don't know if both of you want to respond, or whether anyone has a question. Then I can. Just try.
Is there any question? I mean, I have so many thoughts about this, but maybe it's more interesting to open up the conversation, or like, I don't know.
I mean, it's also nice to hear your reflection if you want to share.
I don't know, maybe I'm lacking factual information and being too much of an idealist, and I think there's too much isn't meant to really come up with a solution. It would be surprising if there was one solution to that, and no one ever came up with it yet. But I think in many aspects, it was interesting that you said that if nature is unjust, we have to change nature, and that triggered many ideas in my mind. One was that Richard Dawkins says that we were produced as gene machines, but we have the ability to revolt against this instinct. And also Temple Grandin has this saying that nature is cruel, but we don't have to be. But I think it's also kind of interesting how this technopositivism, or at least in my mind, is often linked to this denial of negativity, and how it tried to optimize and streamline everything so that everything becomes smooth and friendly and efficient, and just, I mean, then it's like a very interesting thing to think of Temple Grandin, for example, who really revolutionized slaughterhouses and helped a lot and made not probably life but death definitely easier for many animals. But she has a very touching account on her experience on a kosher slaughterhouse, and she says that basically this closeness to the animal restores the kind of sacred framework of taking the life away. And when I say sacred, you can also think of Agamben's Homo Sacer and like the bear life and Zoe, and so how this proximity, this close relationship can restore responsibility and care, and I think it's maybe I don't have a straight point there, but what is very important to me, and why I also balance between this technological perception of cows and their very embodied presence as 600 kilos of flesh and blood and emotions and curiosity and everything that is there and it's in its gracefulness. I think it's just, it would be, or I'm a bit skeptical of this. I don't mean to go back to the good old days. We can also question very much whether there were good old days, when the slaughter of animals in the neighbor and in our own garden was the norm, if it was good or was better. But definitely I think responsibility would be very important. And then you can also think of Donna Haraway with her notion of responsibility and this ability to respond and respect when it comes again to respect to see and these things. But I think, I think it would be important to get closer to these notions and this phenomena.
Yeah, and I'll just add, ending with the kind of picture of cows on a pasture, I realize it invokes a little bit of romanticism, and I mean, I think we also have to be quite critical of romanticism and also critical of the kinds of technologies that become part of dairying, and I definitely don't mean to kind of put forward an anti-technology stance, because I mean, there are many things on a dairy farm that are very important, like vaccines, and you know, we also have to kind of yes. Vaca, right, vash. Yeah, okay, so that's also related to
cows, we have vaccines, and thanks chickens, we have vaccines.
yes, right. But I think also there's a kind of potential use of romanticism, which is interesting, and also something I was kind of prodding at earlier with our restorationists of the bull painting, right? So that it can kind of push for questions of what's possible and what kind of do we want. I mean, there's also, as far as the technological optimism, that has a kind of danger in it, in a sense that, like, often there's this kind of trust that technoscience will simply kind of put a band-aid on any little thing that arises, and so I think that's why I also take quite a critical stance to these kind of ways of shaping the industrial cow through diets, for example, in this case.
I mean, there's very many tricky points. Do you have a question? Okay, can I give it to you?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your presentations. I'm also working on cows, but on cow communication from like a linguistics point of view. So I guess throughout the presentations, I'm looking out for instances where the cow's agency is noted. And the cowlick sculpture was very potent. It's a very beautiful case. Also, the idea that the cows, that the feedlots would have their own hinterland was also really interesting. And then the appearance of the landscape in the true type of cow was also, very vivid. Moment where the cow brings with it the landscape. The cow's made a sculpture. And how do we honor that appearance, really? Except for noticing that, okay, the cow's done something to our design which we didn't anticipate, but has shaped how we view the cow now recursively. So there are these moments in all of the histories that we produce where the cow makes an appearance, but it's so easy for the cow to disappear again. So your question actually about how to listen is also the crux of my research. And there are many ways to listen. It's interesting that in the labeling system as well, it's recognized that the way that we let cows graze is the demarcation for the best kind of cow. Because in my own research, the landscape and the relationship with the plants and what cows know about plants is so incredible and significant. It's how we get milk, it's how we get meat, is on the basis of cows knowing what plants to eat, and knowing where to leave their dung, or knowing which plants not to eat because it's not yet the season for that. So it's all these forms of knowledges that come with their phenomenologies. And I guess it's their phenomenology that is maybe missing from today. So it's more of a comment, but yeah, when it comes to care, I wrote some questions. Does care mean listening? Does care mean giving way? Does care mean saying no sometimes, or does it mean saying only yes? Does care mean saying, what does that say? Does care mean saying sorry for all that we have done wrong? Or does care mean producing only faithful representations, or letting the cow be seen as it wanted to be seen? And these questions all came from a recognition, like a blanket recognition, that it's maybe insufficient for care to mean that we'll do our best given the dismal situation that we find ourselves in. So yeah, maybe a question for both of you. What has care meant in both of your practices as researchers, as artists, in opposition to what you've seen care to be on farms?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that I'm like always struggling with care, right? So I think part of the work is also to become like really specific about different forms of care, because I mean, one of the forms that I was really demonstrating today is the way that care can be kind of a part of the industrial system, right? That it kind of perpetuates it through this kind of constant repair of the breakdowns, right? Within cows, but also within landscapes. But one of the things that I continue to like about care, and that like also comes out of a lot of time spent on farms, observing communication and attempting also, even though I'm an anthropologist, to also kind of learn something about cows. You didn't see it so much in what I talked about today, but there's other places where I do try to like account better for cow agency and microbial agencies and the kind of, you know, multi-species world making that's going on. But that care implies a kind of connection, right? I mean, maybe it's not possible to care about nothing, right? That you have to kind of have something to care about. So there's a way that it kind of brings you closer to something, someone, right? So, yeah, and also just one of the things that we were also seeing in the earlier presentations, right, were these kinds of ways that particular technologies might be kind of intervening in those possibilities of caring attunements. Like one of the things that what you were saying brought to mind is also hormone regimens used on farms in order to kind of put cows on the same estrus cycle so that they can breed them on the same day, which is considered more efficient, right? Which means that which means that farmers no longer have to kind of listen for the sounds that cows make when they're in heat, right? Or observe them kind of mounting each other, and right? I mean, there's a whole possibility there for like a kind of discussion of queerness in dairy farms, right? But like, so that when they have this technology where they simply give them a shot on Tuesday and breed them on Friday, then there's no need anymore to kind of attune, right? It becomes an impediment to that kind of caring observation, that caring kind of connection. Which is all to say that, like, yeah, care is difficult because it's multiple, but there are definitely possibilities there.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and asking the question. I find what you spoke about, I find quite relatable, and I have two reflections or comments on that. One is the phenomenology core part, which I can absolutely relate to. And when I asked Victor and Nicholas about the landscape and commenting on the depth of the landscape, I was very thinking of phenomenology, and especially Merleau-Ponty and his idea of the flash and like denying this duality of the subject observing the object and pushing our conception towards acceptance of us being in the flesh of reality and of life. And I think sometimes these technological devices actually break this embeddedness that would allow us to actually take on responsibility and care. And I think this idea of taking on responsibility links to the other part of your question, that it's a bit of a linguistical game, but I'm from Budapest, Hungary, and in Hungarian, care, I think, would be translated into gondviselés, which is a dual word, and gond means a problem, an issue, and viselés is to carry. You also use a take on a cloth, but it's basically gondviselés in Hungarian, so care in Hungarian means carrying your weight or carrying a problem, taking on a problem. And I think it's very important to, like, caring, as you said, sucks. Actually, we have to accept that like, caring is not something overly polished and beautiful. Taking care means compromise. Taking care means denying something. I can help you moving your whatever on the farm, and I do something for you instead of myself. And I think that's, I mean, it gets too cheesy, but really, I think it's very important to accept negativity, and that's what I meant about this techno-optimism and this endless positivism that tries to deny all negativity in life. I don't know if it makes sense, but definitely flesh and taking care and putting on weight and accepting negativity would be something that in general sounds good, I guess.
I mean, it's also from this idea of kinship, right, with care. Like, how do you, if you see milk production as a way of cows taking care of us, then how can we take care of them in response, and how can we make this an ethical relationship of kinship together with them? And it's also made me think of, like, the 5 domains model that you showed earlier in your presentation. Like, if you look at the basic principles of that system, like based on like these 3 orientations of biological function, affective state, and how they sort of vaguely should represent natural living for cows, how that actually is only looking at, do they get enough food, how do they behave, are they healthy, should we maybe like give them some more air conditioning, and they're never really looking at what does the cow actually need, what kind of knowledge does it already have, like how does it want to behave, does it want to experience different grasses because it gives it joy, like those kind of aspects are never taken into account when we're talking about how we can value, or like can we actually sort of like try to understand if what we're doing is okay or not. Like there's no sort of a principle for that. Okay. Are there any other questions all the way at the back?
I was just curious about storytelling and cows, because in a way, this Haraway idea of stories that matter, and also the linguistic project that was just mentioned now, and also just as researchers, there is an element of storytelling also in how we collect data from farmers, and then how we reproduce that story through research or art or linguistic projects, or in my case also as a storyteller. And I just wondered if there's perhaps a hidden contradiction here, or a contradiction that's a kind of hidden extraction that happens in this process as well, that we too are using cows to tell stories, to make projects, to do research. I'm reflecting on this myself. I'm just wondering how you reflect on that in your own practice, where, yeah, we constantly use cows in systems of production to make value, and in this sense also for research and art. And it's really wonderful when you read Donna Haraway's books, and I sometimes reflect, you know, as a very famous theorist and someone who has a huge cult following, that this really impacts us. We think about things differently. But I wonder in the art world or in the world of research, what it actually does. What does it do? I'm thinking aloud. I'm curious on your thoughts.
That's such a great question, and something I puzzle over a lot. And actually, okay, totally aside, I read this interesting thing in the New Yorker about like how storytelling has become the thing that everybody is talking about. Also, like vodka companies, right? That consumers want a vodka with a story, right? So I think it's such an important question about like what does storytelling do, and what does that mean for us as researchers? And I mean, not just with cows, but like this is also something that cultural anthropology as a discipline has just always struggled with in terms of like representation, and our field went through a kind of crisis of representation in the late 20th century. which was like quite useful also for kind of thinking about the kind of authority that we bring as researchers, and therefore like whose stories do we represent and whose knowledge, and these kinds of really important questions. Which is not to say that it's solved in cultural anthropology, but I think it's also like there's a really kind of generative set of conversations that continue there. And so one of the reasons, I'm kind of working back to your question about storytelling, but one of the reasons I think that matters is that like in my work now, I do a lot of collaborations with like animal welfare scientists and ethologists, right, who never had that kind of crisis of representation in their field, I would say. And if somebody thinks otherwise, let me know. But like, there's still this way that kind of like instinct matters and kind of behavior matters in a way that it doesn't in cultural anthropology, where we talk about practices and performance, right? And so I think there's this kind of generative possibility there through a kind of transdisciplinary, maybe, storytelling of these kind of multi-species worlds, where we can kind of think about what that kind of representation means, and hopefully not just kind of reproduce extraction, which I think a kind of biological determinism does, but that like in my work I try really hard to also kind of be responsible, to like constantly also become able to respond also to not just the kind of humans in the field site, but also the cows, right? Which is also about like paying attention to what cows practice and perform and social relations there. But it's also not something that like I was trained to do as a cultural anthropologist, right? So I'm kind of working with ethologists on some kind of like pasture observational work, where we kind of like spend the day in pastures with cows and see what we can kind of learn. I had another point there, but I've lost it. Yeah, it might be gone. Maybe it'll come back.
Well, very important point there, and I think research extractivism is a thing, and we really have to think about it and reflect on ourselves. And I often face this question myself, and also I'm reminded by external questions to really deal with my conscience as an artist and what I do. And it was interesting because I just ended up doing these chicken and cow projects and pigeon projects quite intuitively, and my emotional drive, or let's say package, to deal with it was 5 years of experience in film production, and basically I just really identified with these animals, and I felt that we share something, and we can it's important to speak about it. And then I finally, a few years later, find myself in a situation where I'm being flown to certain countries to speak about this thing, and basically those chickens pay part of my rent now, and this is problematic, of course. But I think what is like, first of all, again, I have to accept the negativity of it. Second of all, I think, at least as an artist, of course we can, like, you can conceptualize an artist, and in that sense also a scholar or other person who are researching something thoroughly and formulate narratives and ideas about it as a kind of conscience of society. But I don't want to, like, I kind of try to deny this function of being as an artist being outsourced, like, to do the work of conscience and then also come up with a solution and heal all the wounds. And like, I think that's not working. But like, I think responsibility and being respectful is very important. And we can, I mean, I'm definitely that I caused a lot of harm by myself being present in this word since over 3 decades now. So we can always argue whether our life itself is positive, or we are just selfish gene machines trying to survive, to attach back to Dawkins. And this is where we are always an important conflict. But I think it's quite important to accept things, and when it comes to like to question what drives us. And I would feel ashamed if I'm being paid for I don't know, speaking about the chickens, if I was really thinking of like what is an Instagrammable, highly valuable and marketable topic in art that can be channeled into various discourses and monetized effectively, then it would be sucks. But it didn't come like that, because it was genuine fascination that drove me throughout the making of this project, which was again maybe selfish, because actually I identified with these chickens and maybe I projected my own emotions onto them, and they were instrumentalized in that sense. We can always dig very deep into that. Probably that's not the platform. But I would, with that, I would link this to Timothy Morton, who says that fascination is the aesthetic gravitational pull that connects one to another. And I really believe that art has the capacity to trigger fascination, and through fascination, solidarity. And because of that, it's an important means for me, and it's an important means, I believe, in the word. And that was the last 2 sentences in my presentation, but I just didn't find it somehow suitable. But yeah, I think fascination as an aesthetic gravitational pull that triggers solidarity is quite important, and that maybe kind of validates the effort and like kind of balances out the extractionist part of it, that it brings us closer to each other and to animals as well.
Okay, I sort of remembered my which I mean is also coming back to something Luis was also getting us to think about earlier, and something that I think really matters in this time and this moment, right, is to like tell stories that also bring into question human mastery and how the kind of assumptions about human mastery are at play in the world, and how that kind of storytelling also feeds into a kind of technological optimism that like the kind of human capacity to solve all problems with techno-scientific fixes, right? So, I mean, an example is that like I always try to kind of work against that story of mastery as I tell stories. So I have a piece that I wrote about like transcorporeal taste, which is about how cows learn to taste cow feed that is like kind of composed by humans in this total mixed ration, but that like humans also have to learn how to taste like cows in order to like be able to formulate those feeds, right? So that even within this kind of industrial project, even within this kind of like imaginary of human mastery, there is this way that like humans also become more cow-like, and their senses become more bovine. So how to like look for places like for agency for cows to kind of have a different position in relation to the stories that have kind of got us into this particular kind of mess.
Any further questions?
No, okay, yeah. Thank you. Talking about the mess, I'm thinking maybe going back to your presentation, Kathy, it was very striking to see this productivity of milk per cow kind of diagram, right? Less cows, more milk per cow, right? Yeah, and I'm thinking maybe this is the common thing in all presentations. I mean, we can explain what happened here today through this chase for more and more productivity, right? And I'm trying to think a bit of the alternatives. And what I find a bit frustrating is that this productivity justification is always, no one is questioning it, right? For example, most of the agroforestry efforts is to persuade people that agroforestry can be equally productive, right? That, oh, don't be afraid, you're not going to lose productivity. It's just going to be a different configuration, but productivity is there, right? And I'm thinking if anyone else is frustrated with that we're not really changing the paradigm. It's like, okay, let's keep finding things that are less harmful to the environment, less, create less social issues, but are equally productive, right? Even the degrowth discussion is not really questioning the productivity of the basic material needs. It's saying, oh, we have to keep a certain level of productivity there, and get rid of the luxury stuff, for example, right? But no one is really questioning, food. Food needs to be cheap, even under the post-growth, degrowth paradigms, right? So I wonder how you feel about that, if you really see it as an issue or not.
What is more important than growth and money?
I completely agree, and actually, I'm like really ruminating over a conference I recently attended on Euro-Chinese pig knowledge sharing, and it was like all these industries in Denmark coming together to talk about like how they'd help contribute to these like pig high rises, and like how great all these like hyper-prolific sows and I mean, I started kind of asking about the other pigs in China, right? Because there are actually these backyard pigs who are like quite interesting and contribute like in an interesting way to everyday life and forests and all these kinds of things. And then this kind of veterinarian in the room raises his hand and says, those backyard pigs can't feed the world. Organic can't feed the world, right? It's always, and then he said, end of discussion. And so I've been thinking about like the undiscussables, right? That like they're constantly being kind of like cordoned off. And I mean, in this field, you're exactly right that it's about productivity and about growth, right? They're the kind of undiscussables, this kind of neo-Malthusian expectation that always begins with the future population of the world and somehow always forgets that so much good research already shows that there's plenty of food being produced, but that we have all these problems of distribution, right? I mean, and the Wisconsin story, it's always actually overproduction that is the problem for the farms. They are constantly pushed to produce, and yet overproduction is undermining them constantly. And I mean, I wish I'd brought it in earlier, but Julie Livingston's self-devouring growth is a really useful concept, I think, for considering how that kind of constant push for growth, grow, is the undiscussable elephant in the room that's just kind of undermining itself constantly and constantly creating that like crisis of capitalism over and over again. So yeah, I agree. Problem.
Very interesting about that. In the Netherlands, we have the same situation with the productivity and number of cows. And the trend indeed is that the cows is not so much what the breeding is about making them produce more milk, but more fat and protein for longer time, so they can have more lactations, so they can live longer in that sense and be healthier surviving those lactations. But about the question of productivity and the position even of the country in that debate, and even arguing why Netherlands should continue the path it's going, it's because I heard that the other day from an expert is that they consider that the Netherlands is very efficient and we should continue that efficiency trend, because if we don't do it, in other countries produce cheaper, less efficiency, so they say the environmental outcomes will be worse. Yeah. So that way, they're positioning our technology, our way of breeding and having this industry, if we kind of export it, then the solution may be possible. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of an important point here. It's part of course, our economy. And what I think we have seen today is that the cow is there, but it's part of a very complicated set of interests, each one with different responsibilities. And we hope that with this we can have a more holistic view on that problem.
I mean, also, I think that's the point also that Sophia was making earlier too about like these models, right, and where they're produced and then how they're implemented elsewhere, right? Denmark has the same kind of discourse about like, we are the gold standard of pig production, and like, look how great with the hyper-prolific sow, and just ignore all the problems that comes along with it, like the extremely high piglet mortality and yeah, all these kinds of things. But that, like, it's this kind of way of a kind of national imaginary of being kind of the techno-scientific capital of production, and that model needs to be kind of distributed and developed elsewhere, right? Whereas, and attending these conferences where industry folks and veterinarians come, it's often like there's always somebody in the audience, maybe it's usually me, but like who's like, but like what can we actually learn from like other models like the backyard pig, right? Like what could we actually learn from that in terms, because with the pig high rise, right, they're just so terrified of African swine fever that like the workers have to go live there for 2 months and take like these just insane showers that lock them in a shower room if they don't follow every step that they're supposed to do. I mean, like the level of biosecurity. But then like the backyard pigs, maybe there's some kind of potential there that kind of like offers other ways forward, even in light of things like African swine fever, that like the continuing down the path of the high rise doesn't show us, right? So I think the question of like models there becomes extremely important. And knowledges, yeah.
Any other questions? Not really. Do you have questions? Maybe also for the other speakers of earlier today, maybe we can do a...
Do we have time?
Yeah, we have more time for generals.
Okay.
Maybe we can all have every panelist
Yeah.
on the floor and have
Oh,
a
that would
look.
be cool. Can we get all the panelists?
Yeah. Well, we can try and sit. But I mean, we can also just like go through the audience with questions. Because I mean, if you, for instance, like have this idea of productivity and like how if you look at the design of the farm, for instance, with like the early sketches, it will be very interesting to see how those together could like, I don't know, create alternative schemes for how we design farms. And also with these ethics, like how these design of ethics really would like, if now the current handbook is reflected on human tests of how we see animal welfare, how these are now embedded in the design of farms, like how can we actually envision and test out alternatives without using AI software, which would be a horrific way of trying to like capture new ideas, but really like getting this across. And also I think I wrote somewhere in your work also like the importance of like how the word again, the consultants, like the consultant scene in farm industry is massive, and what is actually their role, because they could be like in between the design and then actually getting those regulations in order, but then also trying to convince farmers how we can actually move beyond existing things and trying to test things out, so it can really mediate. So I thought it was interesting. I saw that somewhere in your work.
Interesting to also think about reduction of meat consumption, because according to what all agronomists said us, actually they said that we would have like far less critical environmental footprint if we would stop eating meat. And like for example now we have around I think 1.2 square meters per human sort of arable land to feed ourselves, which tends to decrease toward each of us having 1.4 until 2050. And like they said, like if we would stop or decrease meat consumption, like that would be one of the first things to, when you ask about solutions, like I think there are not only solutions in terms of like farms, but how we eat before all. So, and what we learned is that if we decrease meat production, it goes far better. So, but this is not happening. Meat production increases, like in China, in India as well. Like so, also like the soybeans, that are extracted, like they feed the vegan movement here in the West. So it's actually like actually we can question if vegans have right, like so, because pieces of Amazon they eat. So I think we cannot really, it's naive to search solutions actually, like in that way. And there are some that are really simple, but that are not happening. So maybe it would be nice just to comment on this like vegetarian approach that we did not talk about today, like how much meat each of us eat.
You're working on a project on the green transition in protein.
Yeah. Yeah, so
Yeah, but
it's
is it
not
like
funded,
artificial meat?
but actually Willem back here also is doing a really interesting history of protein. I just learned today. So, I mean, I think the question of protein is really interesting and important. And one of the things that I'm, working towards as I also try to finish my book is a project on these efforts to green animal bodies, right? We heard a little bit about it today, right? But trying to breed pigs who pee less phosphorus and trying to kind of make it so cows produce less methane. And there's a lot of breeding efforts actually in Wisconsin around kind of creating types of kind of climate-friendly cows and stuff like that, but also feeding them seaweed and, but also insect farming is a place where this becomes really interesting and important. I'll just call it a slow collaboration with somebody who's kind of working on home-scale cricket farming in Kenya, but I mean, in that situation, you have a whole different array of issues, right? Because they're actually trying to address childhood malnutrition around protein, right? So there actually is this real need for protein in a way that we don't have in Denmark, and so that's why it's at the elite restaurants that we mostly see the kind of insect eating revolution happening. Which I'm hoping maybe Willem would join us here about questions of protein and this kind of primacy that protein is given as a kind of nutritional element of diets and questions of what kinds of protein and where it comes from and who gets it, right? I wouldn't actually be able to do the field work that I do in Wisconsin if I was vegetarian, because often my available food at a farmer's house is steak or pork, right? So I mean, it's also in a way. George Marcus, a cultural anthropologist, often talks about ethnography or participant observation as this kind of mode of doing research where you become complicit, right? Which also has possibilities for understanding that when you kind of also put up that barrier, you don't have the potential to see, right? So that when you become complicit, you can kind of see what matters in a particular local, right? So, and I don't. Apparently my PhD has made some people vegan, but it didn't make me vegan, in part because I think there are a lot of, I shy away from a kind of animal rights position because I don't see instrumentality as necessarily bad in itself, or even maybe killability. Well, no, killability, yeah, that's a different thing, right? But killing can be done carefully, right, I think. And so I think the work in a way is also to kind of not kind of create a kind of blanket solution, but instead to kind of attend to the kind of specific and place-based contingencies of multi-species worlds, right? So that a kind of articulating a local ethic of care allows us to see that people of Wisconsin, for example, are cow people. It infuses their being that they work and live with cows, and eating meat is part of that. I mean, there are a lot of cultures in areas where it's very hard to grow vegetables who rely on a huge amount of meat in their diet, right? So what happens then if we have this kind of expectation that's the kind of ethical way to live and eat in the world to people who kind of live on seal meat or whale meat or something like that, right? So I think we always have to be quite careful, and again, that's the kind of question of ethical storytelling, and whose stories we tell and whose ideas of health, right? So that a Wisconsin dinner plate, in a sense, is not considered a healthy meal unless there's meat on it. And I might have my personal opinions about it, but it also maybe isn't necessarily my place to decide what a kind of healthy meal should look like in Wisconsin. even while I might be willing to intervene in other aspects of living with cows.
Not to play the advocate of the meat producers, but I always find it funny that if you look at these rankings of different foods according to their environmental impact, I think beef is number 1 or something like that. Maybe lamb is number 2. Number 3, I think, is chocolate, and number 5 is coffee. And you can even say that who even need, I mean, maybe we need protein, but number 3 and 5 is coffee and chocolate, which are like luxury goods. They didn't even exist until like 200 years ago. No one was consuming them. I mean, come on. And then everyone is so obsessed, you know, beef, you know. I mean, no one says anything about chocolate or coffee. So I just wanted to say that as an anecdote, but.
Okay, now I need to respond a bit. Because, I mean, you're right that, of course, the environmental impact of chocolate and coffee are very high, but the consumption of it is also much lower than, let's say, of meat. So, I mean, in terms of the quantitative impact, meat and dairy especially are having a huge effect. I mean, they're probably accountable for about sort of 20% of all the greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So it's a very substantial substantial element of the environmental problems we're facing. So, so in respect to the proteins, I mean, my ERC project is on the political geographies of meat and dairy, or proteinscapes. So it's also connecting many of the themes that have been touched upon today in terms of sort of how the protein transition that we have to go through will affect sort of the landscapes, including the operational landscapes of agro-industrial supply chains across the world. So in terms of how important it is to make that transition away from animal proteins, I would say that it's extremely important. But I agree with you very much that it is very situated. I mean, the geographies of transition are not some kind of unitary kind of transition from one state to the other, as many of the transition studies would have it, but it's incredibly situated in cultural, political kind of context. So the ways in which this can be contested and should be contested are also related to how it becomes political, and where the challenges also in terms of what the role of the state can be in this process, how this is playing out. So this so that's also why it's sort of for the geographical kind of perspective, because these landscapes are variegated and multi-scalar and linked in quite intricate kind of ways. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, because many of the themes that were talked about today are highly relevant also for my project. So thanks for being here. Yeah.
Any last additions from anyone in the crowd or anyone up the stage? No? Oh, yeah.
It's just a comment, but I think it's very important what you said about culture, and like to be a bit more, to have a bit more humility towards like other ways of being. It's a little bit like having the holy grail of how, like, and also going back to Sophia's presentation of like someone prescribing how things should be. And I think it's quite important not to like to be reflected on that. And again, this comment about like, yeah, chocolate and coffee, and like, so this is all like, I think the food industry is very much culturally driven as well, and we tend to discuss it from an economic and a political perspective, and somehow deny the culture part, or like, yeah, it's just like we should let everyone know around the world that this is how things should be, because this is how it's efficient. And like, yeah, but go ahead and try to convince a French person not to have cheese at all, because it's like, good luck with that. And I think it's very important to be reflective on our cultural drives as well. What drives us as humans, and what actually makes us, feel fulfilled in a way. And maybe if your camembert makes you feel fulfilled and a good citizen and a part of society, and that gives you comfort and cultural links and being embedded and having a meaningful life, then it's difficult to optimize everything. And I think this arrogancy of this techno-optimistic streamlining process is also problematic in that sense. I think it's important to think of culture as well, not only like technological solutions to technological problems.
I think it also relates to how we should design this kinship in a way. Like culture should be embedded in both. Do you want to have a last word, Victor?
Well, just say thank you to everybody for such a great day. And yeah, I've been coming from a technical university, which the motto is designing the future, I think that it talks about finding solutions. Maybe we are kind of undermining that role, but I think that it's good to take this reflective approach and to understand that indeed situating ourselves in the context and not thinking of universal technical solutions, sometimes it's a necessary step to take when we design solutions, systems. And I hope that today we kind of got the audience, got a more, say, nuanced observation of the phenomenon we have in the Netherlands on the dairy farming. And let's say, somebody asked me why there's no Dutch person presenting, although there were two Dutch people presenting, but also it was on purpose to bring fresh perspectives from the outside, from different disciplines, different fields, to look at the problem from a different way, find different ways of telling the story, and with that maybe we can bring something back to society and to the global to the conversation that we're having in this country, and. This project finishes end of the month, the funded part of it. But I always see my research as a more long-term project. So actually this cow project began when I was in the Solitude Academy, 2019. And we hope that this conversation will continue some way, either in form of publication or we'll discuss maybe with the drinks. Thank you, everybody. And there's drinks outside. And it's nice to have a nice community here. Thanks. Thank you.